let's walk and talk about Hurricane Harvey, which as of this filming is still very much a disaster. The hurricane has to some extent weakened, it's to some extent moved on, but the flooding remains, and it will for some time. As we talked about on the show yesterday, there are going to be areas that are going to continue to be flooded for weeks after this. And even once the water is gone, once the rain has died, once things have dried up, once the reservoirs are able to be used again, that does not mean that the damage will be done. Now, we're going to move on to that in just a second. But in the short term, you have an absolutely dreadful loss of life. I believe over 40 at this point. And, for anyone to die is obviously a tragedy. And yet we can't help but think of those who have chosen to go into that area specifically to help others, specifically to try to save lives, who have then lost their own lives. To willingly give your life for another is, it's the very definition of heroism, and we've seen that on display every day during this disaster. And then, of course, there are the people who, for no fault of their own, couldn't get out of the way of the flooding, out of the way of the storm. I mean, we saw pictures of seniors living in an assisted living location who had water up to their waist, and there was nothing they could do. There was nowhere that they could go. They weren't physically able to, even if it wasn't so risky, move out of the city, a city that has become basically a post-apocalyptic wasteland in some areas, in some of the hardest hit areas. And thankfully for those individuals, help did come, but for many others it didn't. And some of the most tragic stories involve, there was a mother who tried to save her infant. She ended up drowning. The baby lived by holding on to her dead body in the water and eventually were saved. We've seen some really inspiring stories as well. I mean, long chains of people holding on to each other so that someone whose car is literally floating down the street can be saved. Even a CNN reporter who helped a man out of his car, and that man then credited the reporter as having saved his life. I mean, there are many stories like this, both heartbreaking and heartwarming. And of course, some of the threats are obvious. The actual flooding, the threat of electrocution, which apparently killed a couple of brothers who had gone into the area with a boat to try to save people, which, again, another tragedy. But then there are other concerns that I don't think most people had even considered. And we broke it down in depth on the Young Turks yesterday, so I won't go too in depth here, but the amount of toxins and chemicals that are leaching into the water. I mean, there's obviously disease anytime you have standing water like this, but that also these chemical plants are leaking all sorts of toxins in to the water, which are a threat now, but will continue to be a threat in the future. Once those waters dry, they will leave behind whatever was in them. And not, in some tank in a chemical plant. Anywhere, in a library, in a school, in a playground, a public park, a supermarket, all of these locations won't just have, fungus and mold and all of that to deal with, but they'll also potentially have extremely harmful chemical contamination. And here's the thing, while we're still dealing with Harvey in the short term right now, people who are still unaccounted for, there are dozens who are missing, and I'm scared for the people who are still in that situation. I'm scared for the people who will soon return to Houston to find out what's left of their homes and their automobiles, their businesses, their schools. I'm scared for all of those people, but I'm scared about something else as well, and it's the countdowns that are going on right now. In the longer term, towards the next devastating storm that could hit Houston again, could hit Florida, some other portion of the United States. I'm worried about that, but I'm worried about another timer as well. And that is the countdown that's going on right now until we forget about extreme weather events. We are very short-sighted and have a very short attention span here in the US and around the globe, but especially here in the US, where we will become very interested and worried about a topic when it's happening. And then a day or a week or 2 weeks later, something else will pop into the news and people will very quickly forget how important it was to them at the time, how passionate they felt. And I'm very worried about the people currently suffering, the victims of Harvey, but I'm worried about the victims of the next storm as well. We don't know when it's going to make landfall. It doesn't have a name yet, and yet it will, unfortunately, still have victims of its own. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people who will be affected by extreme weather events exactly like Harvey or worse in the future if we don't get our act together as a species. Look, we know, we're smart enough and we pay enough attention to know that many of the problems facing humanity are within our power and our level of technology to fix if only we had the will to do so. But that is perhaps never as true and as clear as when it comes to dealing with climate change. We have all of the solutions, we have all of the technology, we have the money and we have the intelligence to put them into effect to to ward off, to avoid some of the worst potential consequences of global climate change. But we don't, unfortunately, yet have the numbers or the political will to actually make it happen, to put into effect the necessary subsidies, the government pressure, to force certain technologies to take off, for us to make choices in our own lives in terms of what we consume, what we eat, how we drive, how we power our cars, how much consumption we do in the first place. All of these things are within our power, individually and collectively, if only we make the correct choices. And look, as we continue to deal with the initial cleanup and recovery from Harvey, I hope that people around the country and around the world stay engaged and stay empathic and helpful in the way that they have been already, in sending resources and donating money, sending food, and like all the things that they've been doing. And that is amazing and necessary, and it really does give me a lot of hope. But while they're dealing with this disaster, I hope that they don't forget the long term, and that in the same way that they care about the victims of Harvey, they care about the currently unnamed victims of future disasters that don't need to happen, and certainly don't need to be as devastating as they will be if we do what is necessary today. That's what I'm hoping today. Thank you for walking and talking with me.